More interesting videos are coming soon. Your choice is our goal. Comment what videos you want and subscribe quickly.
Dawn in a forgotten century. The sun had not yet risen over the narrow fields of a small European village when the first signs of life quietly began to stir. A thin mist clung to the damp earth, wrapping the wooden cottages and crooked fences in a pale gray silence. Roosters crowed somewhere beyond the barns, and the distant sound of a wooden door creaking open carried through the morning air. For most people living in the medieval world, the day began long before sunrise. Inside a low, timber-framed house with a roof of straw and reeds, a farmer named Thomas slowly woke from his sleep. The bed he shared with his wife and 2 young children was nothing more than a wooden frame filled with straw and covered by rough wool blankets. The room smelled faintly of smoke from last night's fire, mixed with the earthy scent of damp soil carried in on boots and tools. Homes in medieval villages were simple and often crowded. Many families lived in a single room where cooking, sleeping, eating, and working all happened together. Animals such as chickens or goats were sometimes brought inside during cold nights to keep them safe from thieves or predators. Thomas rubbed his eyes and listened carefully. Outside, the quiet village was beginning to awaken. The distant ringing of a church bell echoed through the fields, signaling the beginning of another long day. The church was the heart of medieval life. It was not just a place of worship, but also the center of community events, announcements, and gatherings. Most villagers measured time not by clocks, but by the ringing of bells and the changing light of the sun. Thomas slowly stood up and stretched his stiff back. Farming in the medieval world demanded strength and endurance. Nearly every day involved hours of hard labor in the fields, regardless of weather. His wife Margaret had already begun preparing breakfast. Breakfast was rarely a large meal. Most families ate something simple, such as coarse bread made from barley or rye. Wheat bread was considered a luxury and usually reserved for wealthy households. Alongside the bread, there might be a small bowl of porridge made from oats or grains cooked slowly over a fire. Margaret stirred the pot while the small flames beneath it crackled softly. Food in the medieval world depended heavily on the seasons. Fresh vegetables were available only at certain times of the year, and preserving food was essential for surviving winter months. People salted meat, dried fruits, and stored grains carefully in wooden containers. The children soon woke as well. Like most children in medieval villages, they would begin learning the responsibilities of work at a very young age. There were no schools for most peasants. Instead, knowledge was passed down through observation and practice. A boy might learn to guide oxen through the fields before he was 10 years old. A girl might learn to spin wool or bake bread beside her mother long before adulthood. Childhood was shorter in those centuries. By the time the sun finally rose above the horizon, the village was fully alive. Smoke curled from dozens of chimneys. Farmers walked toward the fields carrying wooden tools over their shoulders. Women fetched water from nearby wells, balancing heavy buckets carefully. Dogs barked and chickens scattered across muddy paths between houses. Life in medieval villages was simple but demanding. Most villagers were peasants, people who worked the land owned by a local lord. In return for the right to farm small plots of land, they owed labor and taxes to the lord who controlled the manor. This system was known as feudalism. Under feudalism, society was organized in strict layers. At the top were kings and powerful nobles who owned vast territories. Beneath them were knights who served the nobles in war. At the bottom were the peasants who produced nearly all the food that sustained the entire system. For peasants like Thomas, freedom was limited. Some peasants were known as serfs, which meant they were legally tied to the land they worked. They could not simply leave the manor without permission from the lord. Their lives were closely connected to the fields, seasons, and traditions of the village. Yet despite these hardships, medieval villages were also places of strong community. Neighbors depended on each other for survival. When it was time to harvest crops, entire families worked together from sunrise until darkness. When storms damaged houses or barns, villagers gathered to repair them. Festivals and religious celebrations brought moments of joy into otherwise difficult lives. Thomas stepped outside and looked toward the fields. The farmland stretched outward in long, narrow strips divided among the villagers. Instead of large private farms, land was often shared in an open field system where families worked separate strips but followed the same planting schedules. Today would be a day for preparing soil. Spring had arrived only recently, and the ground needed to be turned before seeds could be planted. Thomas walked to the small wooden shed beside his house and lifted a heavy plow tool. It was simple but effective, made mostly of wood with a metal blade forged by the village blacksmith. Blacksmiths were among the most respected craftsmen in medieval villages. They created tools, horseshoes, nails, knives, and other essential items from iron. The rhythmic sound of hammers striking metal often echoed across the village throughout the day. As Thomas approached the fields, he saw other farmers already at work. 2 oxen slowly pulled a plow through dark soil, while a farmer guided it carefully behind them. Oxen were commonly used for heavy labor because they were strong and reliable animals. Horses were faster but more expensive to maintain. The earth turned slowly under the blade, releasing the rich smell of soil. Farming in the medieval world depended heavily on weather. A year of poor harvests could mean hunger for an entire village. A severe drought or endless rain could destroy crops and lead to famine. For that reason, many villagers prayed regularly for good harvests. The church taught that weather, disease, and fortune were all influenced by divine will. Religious faith shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, from daily prayers to grand cathedrals built in distant cities. But far beyond this quiet village, the medieval world was full of complexity and hidden stories. While peasants worked the land, merchants traveled dangerous roads connecting towns and kingdoms. Monks carefully copied books inside silent monasteries. Knights trained for battle under the banners of powerful lords. And in crowded castles, nobles planned marriages and alliances that could change the balance of power across entire regions. And in dark forests beyond the fields, bandits sometimes waited along lonely paths, ready to rob travelers carrying valuable goods. The medieval world was far more than kings and castles. It was a vast network of villages, towns, markets, monasteries, and trade routes. Each place had its own rhythms, struggles, and traditions that shaped everyday life. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the fields filled with movement. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead and paused for a moment to rest. Around him, the quiet village continued its steady rhythm of work. It seemed peaceful, almost timeless. Yet the centuries ahead would bring wars, plagues, discoveries, and transformations that would slowly reshape this hidden world forever. And the story of that world was only beginning.
The hidden life of the medieval world. The secret rhythm of medieval towns. As the morning sun rose higher above the countryside, life in the village fields continued steadily. But not far beyond the farmland, another world was already awake and moving with a completely different energy. The medieval town. Unlike quiet farming villages, towns were places of noise, trade, ambition, and constant movement. They were the beating heart of the medieval economy, where merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and laborers gathered to exchange goods, ideas, and news from distant lands. From a distance, a medieval town could be recognized by its tall church tower rising above clusters of tightly packed houses. Many towns were surrounded by thick defensive walls made of stone or wood. These walls protected the inhabitants from raiders, wild animals, and sometimes even invading armies. At sunrise, the heavy wooden gates in the town walls slowly creaked open. Guards stationed beside the gates examined travelers as they entered. Some were farmers bringing carts filled with vegetables, grain, or eggs to sell at the market. Others were merchants who had traveled for weeks along dusty roads, their wagons loaded with cloth, spices, or metal tools. A narrow road led into the town center. Inside the walls, space was limited and buildings stood close together. Houses leaned slightly toward each other over narrow streets, their upper floors often extending outward. Most buildings were made from timber frames filled with clay or plaster, with steep roofs covered in straw, wood shingles, or clay tiles. The streets themselves were rarely clean. Mud, animal waste, discarded food scraps, and other waste often covered the ground. In many places, there were no proper drainage systems. When it rained, the streets became slippery rivers of mud. Residents sometimes threw waste from their windows into the street below, shouting a warning before doing so. Despite these conditions, towns were vibrant places full of opportunity. Near the center of town was the marketplace. This open square was the busiest place in the entire community. Wooden stalls lined the edges of the square, and merchants shouted loudly to attract customers. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the scent of fish, spices, leather, and smoke from nearby cooking fires. Market days were important events. People from surrounding villages traveled into town to buy items they could not produce themselves. Farmers sold vegetables, fruit, milk, and eggs. Fishermen displayed their catch on wooden tables. Bakers offered loaves of dark bread still warm from the oven. Some merchants sold items that seemed almost magical to villagers who rarely traveled. Silk fabrics from distant Asia, colorful glass beads, rare spices such as pepper and cinnamon, and finely crafted metal tools could sometimes be found in larger towns. These goods had often traveled thousands of miles through complex trade routes. Trade networks during the medieval period stretched across continents. Goods from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia slowly moved into European markets through merchants and caravans. Though travel was slow and dangerous, the desire for valuable goods encouraged traders to risk long journeys. Among the most important people in town were craftsmen. Craftsmen were skilled workers who created essential products using their hands and tools. Each trade usually had its own workshop and area within the town. The blacksmith worked near the edge of town where sparks and smoke would not easily start fires. His forge burned hot as he hammered glowing iron into tools, nails, horseshoes, and weapons. The baker rose long before sunrise to prepare dough for the day's bread. The smell of baking loaves drifted through nearby streets every morning. The butcher prepared cuts of meat, while the tanner worked with animal hides to produce leather. Tanners often worked outside the main town area because the chemicals and rotting hides produced powerful odors. Every craft required years of learning. Young boys who wanted to learn a trade often became apprentices. An apprentice lived with a master craftsman and worked in his workshop for several years. During this time, the apprentice learned skills step by step, from simple tasks to more advanced techniques. After finishing training, the apprentice could become a journeyman. Journeymen were skilled workers who traveled between towns offering their labor. Eventually, after proving their abilities, some journeymen became masters and opened their own workshops. Many crafts were organized into guilds. Guilds were powerful associations that controlled specific trades within a town. A guild set rules about quality, prices, training, and competition. By regulating their trade, members protected their livelihoods and maintained standards for their products. Guilds also acted as social communities. They helped members during illness, supported families during difficult times, and organized religious events or celebrations. At the center of town life stood the church. Church bells rang several times a day, marking important moments from morning prayers to evening gatherings. Almost every resident attended church regularly. Religious festivals filled the calendar with celebrations that provided brief breaks from the demands of work. But towns were not always peaceful places. Crowded living conditions allowed diseases to spread easily. Fires were another constant danger because most buildings were made of wood and thatch. A single spark could quickly turn into a devastating blaze that destroyed entire streets. Night brought another change to the town. As darkness approached, the town gates were closed once again. Guards lit torches along the walls, and the streets slowly grew quieter. Without modern lighting, most people returned to their homes soon after sunset. Inside houses, families gathered around small fires for warmth and cooking. Meals often included thick vegetable stews, bread, cheese, and sometimes small portions of meat. Wealthier merchants and officials enjoyed more varied diets, including spices and imported foods. Evenings were moments for storytelling and conversation. Travelers passing through town often shared news from distant regions. Stories of wars, strange lands, royal politics, and unusual discoveries spread from mouth to mouth in taverns and public squares. These stories connected small towns to the larger medieval world. While peasants worked in the fields and craftsmen built their trades in towns, powerful forces shaped the destiny of kingdoms. Kings struggled to maintain authority over nobles. Knights prepared for battle. Merchants expanded trade networks farther each decade. And quietly, in monasteries and libraries, scholars preserved knowledge that would influence the future of civilization. The medieval world was filled with hidden layers. Beneath the surface of everyday life existed networks of power, belief, ambition, and survival. Each town, village, and castle was a small piece of a much larger story, and that story stretched across centuries. Soon we will travel beyond towns and villages to explore the powerful stone fortresses that dominated the medieval landscape. The castles of lords and knights, where politics, warfare, and strategy shaped the fate of entire regions.
Inside the walls of medieval castles. Far above the villages and towns of the medieval world, rising from rocky hills or standing beside winding rivers, stood the most powerful symbols of authority and protection: the castle. To travelers approaching from the countryside, a castle could appear both magnificent and intimidating. Thick stone walls surrounded the structure, often several meters high and wide enough for soldiers to walk along the top. Towers rose above the walls, allowing guards to watch the land in every direction. These fortresses were not built only for comfort. They were designed first for defense. During the early medieval centuries, many castles were constructed using wood. These early fortifications were known as motte and bailey castles. A large mound of earth called a motte held a wooden tower at the top. At the base of the mound was the bailey, an enclosed yard protected by a wooden fence. Inside the bailey were buildings for storage, animals, soldiers, and servants. Over time, wooden castles were gradually replaced with stronger stone fortresses. Stone castles were far more resistant to fire and attacks, and they could last for centuries. At the center of most castles stood the keep. The keep was the strongest and tallest structure within the castle walls. Its thick stone walls made it the final place of defense during an attack. If enemies managed to break through the outer gates and walls, defenders could retreat into the keep and continue resisting. Inside the keep lived the lord of the castle and his family. A medieval lord controlled the surrounding lands, villages, and farms. Peasants worked the land and paid taxes or provided labor in exchange for protection. The lord's responsibility was to maintain order, settle disputes, and defend the territory during times of conflict. Life inside a castle was very different from life in a village. Although castles symbolized wealth and power, they were not always comfortable places. Stone walls were cold and often damp. Large fireplaces provided warmth, but smoke sometimes filled the rooms before escaping through narrow openings in the roof. The lord's private chambers were usually located in the upper floors of the keep. These rooms were larger and decorated with colorful tapestries hanging on the walls. Tapestries helped keep rooms warmer by blocking drafts from the cold stone. Furniture was simple but carefully crafted. Large wooden tables, heavy chairs, and carved chests filled the rooms. Candles and oil lamps provided light after sunset. Windows were small and narrow because large openings could weaken the walls and make the castle easier to attack. Below the living chambers were storage rooms. Castles needed to store large amounts of food and supplies. In times of war or siege, the inhabitants might be trapped inside the walls for weeks or even months. Grain, salted meat, dried fish, cheese, and barrels of ale were kept in cool storage rooms to last as long as possible. Water was equally important. Some castles had deep wells inside their walls so residents could access fresh water even during a siege. Without a reliable water supply, defending a castle for long periods would be impossible. The castle courtyard was always busy. Soldiers trained with swords and shields, practicing combat skills daily. Horses were cared for in stables. Servants carried firewood, prepared food, cleaned rooms, and performed countless other tasks required to keep the castle functioning. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and armor, while carpenters maintained wooden structures like doors, bridges, and ladders. One of the most important features of many castles was the gatehouse. The gatehouse controlled the main entrance to the fortress. It often contained heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron. A portcullis, a metal gate that could slide down quickly, added another layer of protection. Above the entrance were narrow openings where defenders could drop stones, hot sand, or other objects on attackers trying to break through the gate. Many castles were also surrounded by moats. A moat was a wide ditch filled with water, making it harder for enemies to approach the walls. Some moats contained wooden stakes hidden beneath the surface to discourage attackers from crossing. A drawbridge connected the castle entrance to the outside world. During peaceful times, the drawbridge remained lowered so people and supplies could enter easily. In moments of danger, it could be raised quickly, isolating the castle from approaching enemies. Despite their defensive purpose, castles were also centers of political power. Important meetings, feasts, and ceremonies took place inside the Great Hall of the castle. The Great Hall was usually the largest room, with long tables where guests and residents gathered for meals. During feasts, servants carried platters of roasted meat, bread, vegetables, and sweet pastries. Musicians sometimes played instruments, while entertainers performed stories or tricks for the guests. These gatherings allowed nobles to strengthen alliances and discuss important matters. Knights often lived in or near the castle. Knights were trained warriors who served their lord in battle. Becoming a knight required many years of preparation. Boys from noble families often began training at a young age as pages. They learned manners, reading, and basic combat skills while serving in the lord's household. As they grew older, they became squires. Squires assisted experienced knights by caring for their armor, weapons, and horses. During battles or tournaments, squires remained nearby to help their knight prepare or recover. If a squire proved skilled and honorable, he might eventually be knighted in a special ceremony. Knights were expected to follow a code of conduct known as chivalry. This code emphasized courage, loyalty, and respect, although real life did not always match these ideals perfectly. Beyond the walls of the castle, the surrounding lands formed the manor. The manor included villages, farms, forests, and fields that produced the resources needed to support the castle and its inhabitants. Peasants worked these lands throughout the year, growing crops and raising animals. In return, they received protection from the lord and his soldiers. However, life for peasants remained difficult. Their survival depended on weather, harvest success, and the demands placed upon them by the local lord. Sometimes the peaceful routine of castle life was interrupted by danger. Rival lords, invading armies, or rebellious forces could threaten the region. During such times, villagers might rush toward the castle walls seeking safety, while soldiers prepared for defense. Arrows would be stacked along the walls, boiling water heated in large pots, and watchmen placed in towers to observe approaching enemies. Castles could withstand attacks for long periods if properly supplied. Yet warfare in the medieval world was often unpredictable. Alliances shifted, rivalries grew, and conflict sometimes lasted generations. Still, for most days, life inside the castle continued with its own rhythm. Servants cleaned the halls, guards watched the horizon from high towers, messengers arrived carrying news from distant lands. And far below in the villages, farmers continued their endless work in the fields. Together, castles, towns, and villages formed the structure of medieval society. Each place had its role in a system that defined power, labor, and survival across the centuries. But beyond the noise of markets and the strength of castles, there existed another, quieter world. A world of silence, prayer, and knowledge hidden behind monastery walls. A world where monks spent their lives preserving books, studying scripture, and copying the wisdom of ancient civilizations.
The silent world of monasteries. Far away from the noise of crowded towns and the power struggles inside castles, another kind of community existed across the medieval landscape. These places were quiet, disciplined, and deeply connected to faith. They were monasteries. Monasteries stood in many different locations. Some were built on remote hills, others in deep valleys or beside quiet rivers. Their purpose was to create a place where religious men could devote their entire lives to prayer, study, and service to God. The men who lived in monasteries were called monks. Monks followed strict religious rules that guided every hour of their day. Their lives were built around discipline, simplicity, and devotion. Most monasteries followed a set of instructions known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, which had been written centuries earlier to organize monastic life. This rule emphasized three important values: prayer, work, and obedience. A monk entering a monastery left behind many parts of ordinary life. He promised to live in poverty, meaning he would not own personal wealth. He also promised obedience to the leader of the monastery, known as the abbot. The abbot guided the community and made decisions about daily life. Monasteries were usually surrounded by thick stone walls. Inside those walls stood several buildings arranged around a central courtyard known as the cloister. The cloister was a peaceful garden where monks could walk, reflect, and meditate. The monastery church stood at the center of everything. Prayer was the foundation of monastic life, and monks gathered in the church many times each day and night.
These prayer sessions were called the divine office. Bells rang throughout the monastery to signal when it was time to gather for prayer. The first prayers often began before sunrise. In the darkness of early morning, monks quietly left their small sleeping chambers and walked through candlelit corridors toward the church. Their voices rose together in soft chanting as they recited prayers and sacred texts. This rhythm of prayer continued throughout the day. Between prayer sessions, monks performed different kinds of work. Some worked in gardens, growing vegetables and herbs. Others cared for animals such as sheep, cows, or chickens that provided food and wool. Monasteries were often self-sufficient communities. They produced much of their own food, clothing, and supplies. Fields around the monastery were carefully managed, and water from nearby streams powered mills used to grind grain into flour. One of the most important rooms in many monasteries was the scriptorium. The scriptorium was a quiet chamber where monks copied books by hand. During the medieval period, printing presses did not yet exist. Every book had to be written carefully by hand, using ink and parchment. Parchment was made from treated animal skin. Creating a single book required many hours, sometimes even years, of careful writing and decoration. Monks copied religious texts, historical records, philosophical works, and scientific writings from earlier civilizations. Without these efforts, much ancient knowledge might have disappeared forever. The work of copying books required patience and skill. Monks used feather quills dipped in ink to write each letter slowly and precisely. Some books were decorated with colorful illustrations known as illuminated manuscripts. These decorations included bright colors, gold leaf, and detailed images of religious scenes, plants, animals, and geometric designs. The process was both artistic and spiritual. While writing, monks believed they were helping preserve sacred knowledge for future generations. Monasteries were not completely isolated from the outside world. Travelers often stopped there for rest and food. Monks believed in offering hospitality to strangers, and many monasteries kept guest rooms for visitors. Poor people sometimes came seeking help. Monasteries frequently distributed food to the hungry and cared for the sick. In many regions, monasteries acted as early hospitals where monks treated injuries and illnesses using herbal remedies and basic medical knowledge. Monks also studied plants carefully. Many monasteries maintained herb gardens where medicinal plants were grown. Knowledge about healing herbs was written in books and passed from one generation of monks to the next. These gardens contained plants believed to help with pain, fever, infections, and other ailments. Despite their peaceful purpose, monasteries sometimes faced dangers. During periods of war or invasion, wealthy monasteries could become targets for raiders who hoped to steal valuable books, gold decorations, or stored food supplies. Because of this, some monasteries were built with strong stone walls for protection. Yet most days were calm and predictable. Monks followed the same routine every day. Wake before dawn, pray, work, study, pray again, eat simple meals, pray once more before sleep. Meals were quiet events. In many monasteries, monks ate in silence while one member of the community read passages from religious texts aloud. The food was usually simple: bread, vegetables, soup, and sometimes fish. Meat was often avoided, except on special occasions. Their clothing reflected their commitment to simplicity. Monks wore long robes called habits, usually made from wool. The color of the robe depended on the order of monks. Some wore black, others brown or white. These robes symbolized humility and devotion. Education was another important role of monasteries. Some monasteries trained young boys who showed promise in learning. These students studied reading, writing, Latin, music, and religious teachings. In a time when most people could not read or write, monasteries became centers of knowledge and education. Through the quiet labor of monks, books were preserved, ideas were studied, and history was recorded. Beyond the monastery's walls, the rest of the medieval world continued its busy pace. Farmers worked the land, merchants traveled across continents, knights fought in wars between rival lords. But inside monasteries, time seemed to move differently. Days passed in peaceful repetition. Candlelight flickered across pages of carefully written text. Bells echoed softly through stone corridors. And while kings rose and fell, wars began and ended, and towns grew larger, the monks continued their quiet mission. They protected knowledge in a world that was still slowly learning to understand itself. Yet even monasteries could not escape the great forces that shaped medieval history. Soon, a powerful wave of fear and death would sweep across continents, leaving deep scars on medieval society, a catastrophe that people of the time could hardly explain.
The shadow of the Great Plague. For centuries, the medieval world moved forward with a familiar rhythm. Farmers planted crops each spring and harvested them in autumn. Markets filled with traders and craftsmen. Castles stood watch over valleys and rivers. Monasteries echoed with quiet prayer. Yet in the middle of the 14th century, something began to spread across continents that would shatter the sense of normal life. It began quietly, far away from most European towns. Merchants traveling along ancient trade routes between Asia and Europe started to carry stories of a strange illness. At first, the news sounded distant and uncertain. Traders spoke of cities where people suddenly became sick and died within only a few days. Most listeners did not believe such stories could affect them, but trade routes connected distant lands in ways few people truly understood. Ships, wagons, and caravans moved goods across thousands of miles. Along with silk, spices, and precious metals, they unknowingly carried something far more dangerous, the disease that would later be known as the Black Death. The illness traveled slowly westward through Central Asia, reaching busy trading ports along the Black Sea. From there, merchant ships carried it into Mediterranean cities. In the year 1347, ships arrived at European ports carrying more than cargo. Sailors on board were already sick. Witnesses described terrifying scenes as these ships reached the harbor. Some sailors had already died during the journey, while others were weak and feverish. Their bodies showed dark, swollen lumps beneath the skin. Within days, people in the port cities began showing the same symptoms. The illness spread quickly through crowded streets and marketplaces. Doctors of the time had little understanding of disease. Many believed sickness came from poisonous air or punishment from divine forces. People did not yet know that the disease was spreading through fleas carried by rats that traveled aboard ships and carts. Cities provided the perfect environment for the disease to spread. Medieval towns were crowded and often unsanitary. Waste filled the streets and rats thrived in the dark corners of houses, warehouses, and food storage areas. Once the plague entered a city, it moved with frightening speed. People who were healthy one day could suddenly develop fever and weakness the next. Painful swellings appeared in the neck, under the arms, or near the groin. These swellings were called buboes, and they often turned dark as the disease progressed. Within only a few days, many victims died. Families watched helplessly as loved ones grew weaker. Doctors attempted treatments using herbs, bloodletting, or prayers, but nothing seemed to stop the illness. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. In many towns, church bells rang constantly for funerals.
Graveyards quickly filled, and new burial pits had to be dug outside city walls. Some cities became so overwhelmed that bodies were buried in large communal graves. News of the plague spread from town to town. Travelers carried stories of entire villages falling silent. Merchants abandoned markets. Roads once busy with carts and horses grew strangely quiet. As the disease moved across Europe, people searched desperately for explanations. Many believed the plague was a punishment sent by God. Religious processions filled the streets as people prayed for mercy. Some groups traveled from town to town performing acts of public penance, believing suffering would bring forgiveness. Others looked for someone to blame. Fear and confusion sometimes led to terrible acts against innocent people. Communities accused certain groups of causing the plague, leading to violence and persecution. Yet the truth remained unknown. The plague did not discriminate between rich and poor. Nobles inside castles, merchants in cities, monks in monasteries, and peasants in villages all faced the same terrifying danger. Even monasteries, which had long been places of peace and learning, were deeply affected. Monks who cared for the sick sometimes became ill themselves. In some monasteries, entire communities were lost within a short period of time. Libraries filled with carefully copied books were left silent and empty. Fields across the countryside were also affected. With so many farmers sick or gone, crops were sometimes left unharvested. Livestock wandered unattended. Villages that had existed for generations suddenly found themselves nearly abandoned. The scale of the disaster was almost impossible for people of the time to comprehend. Historians today estimate that the plague may have taken the lives of nearly 1/3 of Europe's population. Some regions lost even more. Cities that had once been crowded suddenly had empty houses and silent streets. Yet even during this dark time, small acts of courage and kindness appeared. Some doctors and priests continued helping the sick despite the risk to their own lives. Neighbors sometimes cared for children who had lost parents. Travelers carried messages between separated families. Human compassion did not disappear even during the worst moments of fear. After several years, the intensity of the plague slowly began to fade. The disease did not vanish completely. It returned in smaller waves over the following centuries. But the first great outbreak had already changed the medieval world forever. With fewer workers available, peasants in some regions gained greater bargaining power. Landowners who once controlled large populations of laborers suddenly needed workers more than workers needed them. This shift slowly began to weaken the rigid structure of feudal society. Wages rose in some areas. Farmers could sometimes move to new lands in search of better opportunities. Towns began to change as labor shortages forced new ideas about work and trade. The plague had brought unimaginable loss, yet it also reshaped society in ways that would eventually lead toward new economic systems and social changes. Life slowly returned to towns and villages. Markets reopened. Fields were planted again. New families moved into houses that had once stood empty, but the memory of the plague remained deeply etched in the minds of those who survived. It reminded people how fragile life could be, and it changed the course of medieval history forever. Beyond the sorrow and rebuilding, new forms of culture, art, and thought began to emerge as people tried to understand the world around them. Artists painted scenes reflecting both fear and hope. Scholars studied nature more carefully. New questions about life, faith, and society slowly began to grow. The medieval world had been shaken, but it was not finished changing. Soon, new ideas would begin to spread through universities and cities, challenging old traditions and preparing the way for a different future.
The rise of medieval learning. After the Great Plague had swept across lands and kingdoms, the medieval world slowly began to rebuild. Villages planted crops again, towns reopened their markets, and castles returned to their ordinary routines. Yet something deeper had also begun to change. People had witnessed how fragile life could be. Questions about faith, science, medicine, and the nature of the world began to grow stronger. Many scholars wanted to understand not only religious teachings, but also the laws of nature and the ideas of earlier civilizations. Out of this desire for knowledge, a new kind of institution began to grow: the medieval university. Long before modern schools and colleges existed, small groups of teachers and students gathered in certain cities to study subjects such as philosophy, theology, law, and medicine. These gatherings eventually developed into organized communities of learning, known as universities. One of the earliest centers of this learning appeared in the Italian city of Bologna. There, students traveled from different regions to study law, especially the legal traditions inherited from the ancient Roman Empire. Teachers lectured from handwritten manuscripts, while students copied the lessons carefully onto parchment. Another important center of learning appeared in Paris. In Paris, scholars focused heavily on theology and philosophy. The city attracted students from across Europe who wished to study religious thought and the writings of ancient philosophers. Universities soon appeared in other cities as well. Oxford and Cambridge in England became important centers of scholarship. Salamanca in Spain and Prague in Central Europe also developed strong academic communities. Travel to these universities was not easy. Students often walked for weeks or months across rough roads to reach the cities where teachers lived. They carried few belongings, often just a small bag containing books, clothing, and writing tools. Once they arrived, life as a student could be difficult. Most students lived in small rented rooms or simple dormitories. They often shared meals together to reduce costs. Food was basic and sometimes scarce, but the opportunity to study attracted people willing to endure hardship. The language of learning in medieval universities was Latin. Latin allowed scholars from many different countries to communicate and study together. A student from England could attend lectures with classmates from France, Italy, or Germany because all lessons were taught in the same language. The structure of university study followed a clear path. Students first studied the liberal arts. These subjects formed the foundation of medieval education. The liberal arts were divided into two groups known as the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium included grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar taught students how to read and write Latin correctly. Rhetoric focused on the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Logic trained students to think clearly and analyze arguments. The quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These subjects helped students understand mathematical patterns in the world around them. Astronomy, for example, involved studying the movements of stars and planets, which were believed to influence seasons and natural events. After completing these basic studies, students could move on to advanced fields. Some studied law, learning how to interpret legal systems and resolve disputes. Others studied medicine, exploring the limited medical knowledge available at the time. The most respected field of study was theology. Theology involved studying religious teachings and attempting to understand the nature of God, faith, and morality. Many scholars believed that understanding divine truth was the highest goal of learning. Lectures formed the center of university life. A teacher sat at the front of a hall, reading passages from important books while explaining their meaning. Students listened carefully and copied the words into their own notebooks. Books were extremely rare and valuable. Because printing had not yet been invented, every book had to be copied by hand. Some universities chained important books to desks so they could not be stolen. Debates were another important part of learning. Students and teachers gathered to discuss difficult questions. These debates could last for hours as participants argued different viewpoints using logic and evidence from religious texts or philosophical writings. Such debates sharpened the minds of scholars and helped develop new ideas. Medieval scholars were especially influenced by the works of ancient Greek philosophers. For many centuries, the writings of philosophers such as Aristotle had been preserved and studied in the Islamic world. Through translations into Latin, these ideas gradually reached European universities. Scholars began studying these texts intensely. They tried to combine ancient philosophy with Christian theology, creating complex systems of thought that attempted to explain both faith and reason. One famous method of study was known as scholasticism. Scholastic scholars believed that careful reasoning and debate could help reveal deeper truths about the universe and religious belief. They analyzed difficult questions step by step, examining arguments from different perspectives before reaching conclusions. University life also had its lighter moments. Students sometimes organized celebrations and gatherings. Friendships formed between people from distant lands who might otherwise never have met. Yet student life could also lead to trouble. Young scholars occasionally clashed with townspeople, especially when disagreements arose over housing, food prices, or behavior. Some universities even had special legal protections for students, which sometimes caused tension with local authorities. Despite these challenges, universities slowly grew in influence.
Graduates often became advisors to kings, church leaders, and government officials. Their knowledge helped shape laws, religious teachings, and administrative systems. Education was still limited to a small portion of the population. Most peasants and workers in villages never attended school. However, the knowledge developed in universities gradually influenced society through written texts, church teachings, and government decisions. Libraries within universities and monasteries slowly expanded. Books about mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and history were copied and preserved. Each new generation of scholars added ideas and interpretations to these collections. This growing body of knowledge would later play a key role in shaping the future. Though the medieval world still relied heavily on tradition and religious authority, curiosity about the natural world and human understanding was beginning to grow. Quietly, in classrooms filled with candlelight and parchment pages, the seeds of intellectual transformation were being planted. But while scholars studied in peaceful halls, another group of people carried news, culture, and stories across kingdoms. They were not monks or professors. They were travelers, performers, and storytellers who moved constantly from place to place. And through their voices, the medieval world shared its legends, music, and imagination. If you want to continue the journey, say,
Roads, travelers, and the wandering storytellers. While farmers worked quietly in their fields and scholars studied inside university halls, another part of medieval life unfolded along dusty roads that stretched across kingdoms and forests. These roads connected villages, towns, castles, and distant cities. Travel in the medieval world was slow and often dangerous. Most roads were not paved, and during rainy seasons, they turned into thick mud that made carts difficult to move. In winter, snow and freezing winds could make travel nearly impossible. Yet people continued to travel. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, soldiers, and wandering entertainers all moved along these routes. Through them, goods, news, and stories spread across great distances. Merchants were among the most important travelers. They carried products that villages and towns could not produce themselves. Some merchants traveled only short distances between nearby towns, bringing grain, wool, or tools. Others traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles. Long-distance merchants transported valuable goods such as silk, spices, fine fabrics, glassware, and precious metals. These items often came from lands far beyond Europe, including the Middle East and Asia. The journey of a merchant could take months. They usually traveled in groups called caravans for safety. Bandits sometimes waited along remote roads, hoping to rob travelers carrying valuable cargo. A group of merchants traveling together with guards stood a better chance of reaching their destination safely. Horses and oxen pulled wooden wagons filled with goods. Some merchants also traveled on horseback, carrying smaller but valuable items in saddlebags. Each stop along the journey might include an inn, monastery, or village where travelers could rest for the night. Inns were important places for travelers. These establishments provided food, drink, and beds for those passing through. Conditions varied greatly. Some inns were warm and welcoming, while others were crowded and uncomfortable. Travelers often shared rooms with strangers and slept on simple wooden beds covered with straw mattresses. But inns offered more than just rest. They were also places where news and stories spread quickly. Merchants spoke about distant markets, travelers described unusual customs from other lands, and messengers shared news of wars or royal decisions. Through these conversations, information traveled across the medieval world. Among the most interesting travelers were pilgrims. Pilgrims were people who journeyed to sacred religious sites. They believed that visiting holy places could bring spiritual blessings, forgiveness, or healing. Pilgrimage routes stretched across continents. Some pilgrims traveled to famous shrines within their own countries, while others walked long distances to reach holy cities. The journeys were often difficult and required great determination. Pilgrims usually carried simple belongings. They wore sturdy clothing, carried walking staffs, and sometimes wore special badges or symbols that identified them as pilgrims. These symbols helped them receive hospitality along the way, as many monasteries and towns offered assistance to religious travelers. Pilgrimages also created busy travel routes filled with people from many different backgrounds. Farmers, merchants, nobles, and priests might walk the same roads together. Along the way, they shared meals, stories, and experiences. Another group of travelers added color and excitement to medieval life. These were the wandering entertainers. Known as minstrels, troubadours, or storytellers, they moved from town to town performing music, poetry, and tales of adventure. Their performances brought joy and entertainment to people who otherwise had little access to such experiences. Minstrels often carried musical instruments. Lutes, harps, flutes, and small drums accompanied their songs. Some performers sang about legendary heroes and ancient battles. Others told romantic stories of knights and noble ladies. Their performances could take place in many locations. In villages, they might stand in a marketplace surrounded by curious listeners. In castles, they sometimes entertained nobles during feasts or celebrations. Stories told by these entertainers often blended history with imagination. Tales of brave knights rescuing kingdoms, magical creatures hiding in forests, and distant lands filled with wonders captured the attention of audiences. Though not all these stories were true, they helped shape the cultural imagination of medieval society. Traveling performers also spread cultural traditions between regions. A song learned in one kingdom might be performed months later in another. In this way, music and storytelling connected distant communities. Messengers were another vital part of medieval travel. Kings and nobles relied on messengers to carry letters and official documents across large territories. These riders often traveled quickly, changing horses at stations along major routes to maintain speed. Their messages might include military orders, diplomatic agreements, or important political news. Without these messengers, communication between distant regions would have been extremely slow. Not all travelers moved for trade or entertainment. Some were explorers driven by curiosity about the world. Though medieval maps were limited and sometimes inaccurate, people still wondered about lands beyond the horizon. Travelers returning from distant journeys sometimes described unfamiliar cultures, strange animals, and cities far larger than those found in Europe. These stories fascinated listeners who had never traveled far from their homes. Yet the roads were not always safe places. Bandits sometimes hid along forest paths, waiting to ambush travelers carrying valuable cargo. Sudden storms could damage wagons or cause rivers to flood, blocking the route forward. Disease also traveled along these same roads. As merchants and travelers moved from place to place, they unknowingly carried illnesses with them, allowing outbreaks to spread between towns. Despite these dangers, travel continued because it was essential for trade, religion, and communication. Roads were the veins through which the lifeblood of the medieval world flowed. Through them came spices from distant markets, letters between kings, songs of wandering musicians, and the experiences of pilgrims seeking spiritual meaning. By the time a traveler returned home after months or years away, they often carried more than goods. They carried stories. Stories of new lands, strange customs, powerful rulers, and surprising discoveries. These stories helped shape how medieval people understood the wider world beyond their villages and towns. But while travelers carried news across roads, another powerful force shaped daily life even more strongly: religion. Faith guided laws, traditions, celebrations, and personal beliefs throughout medieval society. Churches dominated town skylines, and religious festivals filled the yearly calendar. To understand the hidden life of the medieval world, one must also understand the powerful influence of faith.
Faith and religion in everyday life. In the medieval world, religion was not just a personal belief. It was the lens through which people understood everything: life, death, work, and the natural world. From the smallest village to the grandest castle, the church influenced nearly every aspect of daily life. Every town and village had at least one church, Its tower or spire often dominated the skyline, a visible symbol of faith and authority. The sound of church bells marked the rhythm of life. Bells called people to prayer, announced important events, and warned of danger. Life for most people began and ended with prayer. Before sunrise, farmers and laborers might kneel beside their beds to recite simple prayers. At mealtimes, a short blessing of thanks was common, even for those who could barely afford food. At night, candles flickered as families prayed for protection from disease, thieves, or disaster. The medieval calendar revolved around religious festivals. Easter and Christmas were the most important celebrations, bringing together entire communities. Saints' days marked smaller local celebrations, often tied to the patron saint of a town or village. On these days, work paused, and people attended church services, feasts, and sometimes even fairs. For the wealthy, religion took on additional layers of power and influence. Kings and nobles often funded the construction of churches and cathedrals to demonstrate piety and prestige. These structures were not just places of worship, they were symbols of social and political status, built to inspire awe and respect. Cathedrals in particular were marvels of engineering and art. Their tall spires reached toward the heavens, while stained glass windows told stories from the Bible in brilliant colors. Light streaming through the glass created a mystical atmosphere inside, reminding visitors of divine presence. Stone carvings, statues, and elaborate altars decorated nearly every space. Inside churches, the priest guided the spiritual life of the community. Priests conducted masses, performed baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and offered guidance on moral and ethical questions. They were also responsible for keeping records, such as births, deaths, and marriages, a role that made the church central to the administration of society. Religion influenced work as much as worship. Farmers often followed the agricultural calendar dictated by church holidays. Certain days were considered holy and forbidden for labor. Even legal systems were influenced by religious principles. Sin and crime often overlapped in the medieval mind, and moral behavior was tied closely to law and social expectation. Monasteries and convents were extensions of religious life. Monks and nuns followed strict routines of prayer, study, and labor. Their communities produced food, cared for the sick, and preserved knowledge. Many of the greatest thinkers, scientists, and philosophers of the medieval world emerged from these religious institutions. Pilgrimages were another important aspect of faith. People traveled long distances to visit sacred sites, such as Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome in Italy. Pilgrimages were acts of devotion, penance, or hope for healing. Along the way, pilgrims shared stories, encountered new ideas, and connected regions culturally and spiritually. Religious belief also shaped how people understood suffering and death. Disease, famine, and war were often seen as divine punishment or trials. This perspective helped many endure hardships, but it also fueled fear and superstition. Practices such as relic worship, prayers for saints, and participation in holy rituals offered hope in uncertain times. Churches also played a role in education. Many early schools were attached to religious institutions. Young boys were taught to read, write, and understand scripture. Some advanced to universities, where theology and philosophy were central fields of study. Art, music, and literature were also deeply connected to religion. Gregorian chants filled monasteries and cathedrals. Religious plays and pageants portrayed biblical stories for largely illiterate audiences. Artists depicted saints, miracles, and moral lessons, reinforcing the teachings of the church visually and emotionally. The influence of religion was not always peaceful. Conflicts over faith occasionally erupted into violence. Heresies, beliefs, or practices considered outside excited doctrine were often met with harsh punishment. Crusades, wars fought in the name of religion, sent armies across continents to conquer and defend territories deemed sacred. Yet for most people, religion was a source of comfort, guidance, and community. It provided answers to questions about life and death that otherwise seemed incomprehensible. It connected villages, towns, and kingdoms through shared beliefs, rituals, and moral codes. The medieval world was thus not only one of labor, castles, and markets, but also a world where the spiritual and the practical were inseparable. People moved through their daily lives under the watchful eyes of God, guided by rituals, prayers, and the moral authority of the Church. Yet beneath this surface of faith and devotion, other aspects of daily life thrived in secret or on the margins. Crafts, festivals, superstitions, and local traditions that were not always controlled by church doctrine. These hidden layers of culture added color, humor, and humanity to medieval life, balancing fear and obedience with creativity and celebration. If you want to continue the story, say,
Life among the people, peasants, craftsmen, and festivals. While castles rose above the landscape and churches guided the spiritual life of communities, the majority of the medieval population lived far from these centers of power. They were peasants, laborers, and craftsmen, people whose daily lives were filled with work, struggle, and the small pleasures that brought color to a demanding world. Most peasants lived in small villages clustered around farmland. Their homes were simple structures made from wood, clay, and straw, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Inside, the entire family often shared a single room, which served as both living space and sleeping area. A hearth in the center provided warmth and a place to cook, while basic tools and handmade furniture filled the rest of the home. Life was governed by the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer demanded constant care of crops. Autumn was the time of harvest, and winter brought rest and preparation for the next cycle. Villagers worked long hours, but they also developed skills passed down through generations, knowledge of crops, livestock, carpentry, weaving, and other crafts that sustained daily life. Peasants owed labor and taxes to their lord. This often included a portion of their harvest, payments in goods, or mandatory work on the lord's lands. The demands could be harsh, but protection from the lord's soldiers and access to shared land were essential for survival. Not all work was bleak, however. Community life provided moments of celebration, creativity, and amusement. Festivals marked key points in the agricultural and religious calendar. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and seasonal celebrations allowed villagers to take a break from labor, share food and drink, and participate in music, dancing, and games. Craftsmen occupied a slightly different space within medieval society. Skilled workers such as blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and tanners provided essential goods for everyday life. In towns, their workshops were often clustered together in areas known as streets of the craft. Young apprentices learned trades under the guidance of masters, while journeymen traveled to gain experience and earn wages. Guilds regulated many trades. These organizations protected members' rights, maintained standards of quality, set prices, and provided social support in times of illness or hardship. Guilds also organized public events, religious celebrations, and even funerals for their members, blending work with community responsibility. Markets and fairs were central to the life of both peasants and townspeople. Local markets offered fresh produce, meat, fish, bread, and everyday goods. Traveling fairs, often held annually, attracted merchants from distant regions, bringing spices, fabrics, tools, and exotic goods. These gatherings were also social events, with entertainers, jugglers, musicians, and storytellers adding excitement to the marketplace. Peasants and townspeople alike developed cultural practices and traditions alongside their work. Folk tales, songs, and local legends provided entertainment and conveyed lessons about morality, courage, and cunning. Seasonal rituals celebrated planting and harvest, while storytelling preserved history, humor, and collective memory. Despite hardships, communities often displayed resilience. Villagers shared labor when needed, helped each other during crises, and maintained traditions that strengthened identity and belonging. Humor and creativity found expression in songs, festivals, and handcrafted goods, offering relief from monotony and toil. Yet life could be precarious. Disease, poor harvests, and conflict were constant threats. Famines and epidemics could strike suddenly, reminding communities of life's fragility. Even so, people adapted, relying on resourcefulness, communal cooperation, and faith to navigate uncertainty. Crafts, trade, festivals, and folklore created a hidden vibrancy in medieval life. Beneath the structures of lords, churches, and laws, ordinary people built their own rhythms, connections, and pleasures. These cultural threads would influence literature, art, and social practices for centuries to come. While peasants and craftsmen formed the foundation of medieval society, another group shaped its movements, conflicts, and protection: the soldiers and knights. These warriors were both feared and celebrated, central to defense, conquest, and the ideals of chivalry that dominated medieval imagination. If you want to continue the story, say,
Knights, warfare, and the code of chivalry. In the medieval world, while peasants toiled and merchants traveled, another class of people held a unique place of power and influence: the knights. Clad in armor, mounted on horseback, and trained in the arts of war, knights were both defenders of the realm and symbols of a society built on loyalty, honor, and service. The path to knighthood began early in life. Boys born into noble families were introduced to martial training as pages, often by the age of 7. Pages learned manners, basic literacy, riding, and the rudiments of combat. By adolescence, many became squires, serving a knight directly. Squires polished armor, cared for horses, maintained weapons, and practiced fighting skills under close supervision. The final step came in a formal ceremony of knighthood. After years of training and service, a squire was tested for courage, skill, and loyalty. The ceremony often involved a night of prayer, a ritual bath symbolizing purification, and the dubbing with a sword on the shoulders. The new knight swore to uphold the code of chivalry, a set of ethical and martial principles guiding behavior both on and off the battlefield. Chivalry demanded courage in battle, loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, and respect for women. In reality, adherence varied widely. Knights might be fierce warriors in one context and ruthless in another, but the ideal of honor shaped how society viewed their role. Knights were central to medieval warfare. Castles, towns, and kingdoms relied on them for defense and conquest. Battles often began with careful strategy as armies maneuvered to gain the advantage over terrain, supply lines, and fortifications. Knights typically formed the elite mounted units, charging into battle with lances and swords, while foot soldiers, archers, and siege engines supported them. Weapons and armor evolved to meet the demands of combat. Chainmail, plate armor, and helmets provided protection, while swords, maces, axes, and lances served as tools of war. Horses were trained for both speed and endurance, often wearing protective barding. A well-equipped knight was a symbol of strength and intimidation on the battlefield. Beyond open combat, knights participated in tournaments and jousts. These events allowed warriors to practice skills, demonstrate courage, and gain prestige without the full dangers of war. Jousting involved two knights charging at each other with lances, aiming to unseat their opponent. Tournaments drew crowds from across the region, offering excitement, social interaction, and opportunities for fame. Knights also played a role in the social hierarchy. They were vassals to lords, bound by feudal obligations to provide military service in exchange for land or privileges. Their responsibilities included defending territory, enforcing law, and participating in campaigns, sometimes far from home. Warfare was not limited to knights alone. Foot soldiers, archers, and siege engines performed crucial roles. Castles were attacked using ladders, battering rams, and early artillery like catapults. Defenders poured boiling oil, dropped stones, and fired arrows to protect their walls. Battles were as much about strategy, logistics, and planning as about individual courage. The life of a knight extended beyond battle. Knights were expected to be cultured and educated. Reading, writing, poetry, and music were part of a noble upbringing. Many knights engaged in courtly love, a tradition emphasizing respectful devotion to women and virtuous conduct, though often more symbolic than practical. Religious faith guided knights as well. Many took vows before battle or pilgrimage. Crusades, wars sanctioned by the church to reclaim holy lands, became defining experiences for knights in Europe. These campaigns combined military action with spiritual motivation, promising honor and, for some, the hope of eternal reward. Despite the grandeur and prestige, knighthood carried risk and hardship. Armor was heavy, travel was dangerous, and injuries were frequent. Battles could be brutal, with large-scale casualties and chaotic fighting. Knights were exposed to disease, hunger, and extreme weather during campaigns. The ideal of chivalry also created social expectations. A knight who violated the code could lose reputation, favor, and influence. Honor mattered as much as skill with weapons. Stories of legendary knights, Arthur, Lancelot, and Roland, illustrated the combination of bravery, loyalty, and moral conduct that medieval society admired. Knights also contributed to the cultural imagination of the medieval world. Tales of heroism, quests, and battles spread through minstrels, manuscripts, and oral storytelling. These legends reinforced ideals of courage and virtue, inspiring both the elite and ordinary people who admired their feats. While knights defended castles and fought wars, everyday life for most people continued alongside theirs. Peasants harvested fields, merchants traveled roads, craftsmen honed their trades, and festivals filled the calendar. The interplay of these classes, lords, knights, merchants, and laborers, created the complex social fabric of medieval society. In the midst of war and ritual, medieval society balanced power, duty, and imagination. Knights embodied both the dangers and the ideals of their world. Their presence reminded communities of loyalty, strength, and courage, yet their lives were inseparable from the peasants, townspeople, and scholars who formed the backbone of society. Soon, the story of the medieval world will move from warriors to the imagination, art, and secret lives of women, often hidden behind walls, veils, or social conventions, yet influencing culture in profound ways. If you want to continue the journey, say,
The hidden lives and influence of medieval women. In the medieval world, most historical records focus on kings, knights, and men of power. Yet women played vital roles in every level of society, shaping households, communities, culture, and even politics, often in ways that remain hidden from the surface of history. Life for most women began at home. In peasant villages, girls learned practical skills from an early age: cooking, weaving, caring for animals, tending gardens, and assisting in agricultural work. Their labor was essential for family survival. Women prepared food for the household, preserved produce for winter, and made clothing from wool, flax, or other local materials. Women were also responsible for managing the household economy. They kept accounts of supplies, oversaw servants or younger children, and ensured the family had food, water, and basic comforts. In noble households, this role expanded to include managing multiple servants, overseeing kitchens, laundries, and storerooms, and coordinating the daily operations of the manor. Marriage was a major milestone in a woman's life, often arranged to strengthen family alliances, secure property, or gain political advantage. Noble women sometimes married in their early teens, while peasant women married slightly later. Dowries, gifts of property, money, or goods from the bride's family, were common and could influence social standing. Despite societal restrictions, women found opportunities to exert influence. Noble women could manage estates when their husbands were away at war, make important decisions regarding finances, and even act as patrons of arts or religious institutions. Some women used their social positions to mediate disputes or influence political alliances. Religious life offered another path for women. Convents provided spaces where women could pursue education, spiritual leadership, and independence from traditional family roles. Nuns copied manuscripts, managed convent resources, and taught young girls to read and write. Some abbesses, leaders of convents, held remarkable authority, controlling significant lands and wealth. In towns and cities, women participated in craft and trade. They could be weavers, brewers, bakers, or merchants, sometimes running businesses independently or alongside male relatives. Guild membership for women was less common, but exceptions existed, especially when widows inherited a husband's trade. Cultural and artistic contributions of women were often subtle but significant. Women in noble courts patronized music, poetry, and literature. They encouraged storytelling, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, and inspired the themes of courtly love that dominated medieval literature. Even women without wealth contributed through embroidery, textile production, and local crafts that reflected community identity. The hidden lives of women also included challenges and constraints. Legal rights were limited, and social norms often restricted public participation. Inheritance laws favored male heirs, and education opportunities were scarce for most girls. Despite these limitations, women navigated their roles with resilience and resourcefulness, influencing households, communities, and culture in ways often overlooked by historical records. Marriage and family life also intersected with health and survival. Childbirth was dangerous, and mortality rates for mothers and infants were high. Women relied on knowledge of herbal remedies, midwives, and communal support networks to care for families. This knowledge, passed through generations, shaped medicine and domestic practice throughout the medieval period. Women also engaged in spiritual and ritual life outside convents. They participated in pilgrimages, attended church services, and performed acts of devotion at home. Religious festivals, saints' days, and seasonal celebrations were spaces where women could participate publicly, maintain social bonds, and express cultural creativity. Despite being largely absent from official chronicles, women's influence touched every part of the medieval world. Their labor sustained families and communities. Their management preserved estates, resources, and knowledge. Their creativity shaped art, literature, and religious life. The hidden world of women demonstrates how medieval society depended on both visible power and the quiet, persistent work of those often overlooked. Through their labor, intellect, and cultural contributions, women shaped the rhythms, resilience, and imagination of daily life. Yet even as households and communities thrived, the medieval world remained vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Natural disasters, disease, and climate shifts continually challenged survival, shaping both social structures and individual lives in profound ways. If you want to continue the story, say,
Trade, markets, and the hidden economy. While knights defended lands and peasants worked the fields, another force quietly shaped medieval life: commerce. Trade connected villages, towns, and cities, and merchants created a hidden world of exchange that influenced wealth, culture, and even politics. Local markets formed the backbone of medieval economies. In villages, weekly markets provided farmers and craftsmen a place to sell surplus goods. Grain, vegetables, wool, dairy products, pottery, and simple tools were traded for necessities or money. These markets also served as social hubs, where news, gossip, and cultural practices spread quickly among locals. Larger towns hosted more extensive marketplaces. Here, merchants from different regions brought exotic goods, spices from the East, fine fabrics from Flanders, glassware from Italy, and metals from distant mines. Markets were bustling spaces filled with the sounds of bartering, carts, and livestock. Merchants used scales, weights, and coins to standardize transactions, gradually creating trust and reliability in trade. Fairs were another vital aspect of commerce. Unlike weekly markets, fairs often lasted for several days or weeks and attracted traders from distant regions. They were usually tied to religious festivals or important dates, combining trade with celebration. Fairs were opportunities for artisans to display new inventions, for performers to entertain crowds, and for social networks to grow across regions. Merchants often traveled long distances along trade routes that connected kingdoms and continents. Some carried goods by horse-drawn carts, while others used ships to cross rivers and seas. The Hanseatic League, for example, was a network of merchant cities in Northern Europe that coordinated trade, protected merchants, and standardized commercial practices across vast regions. Trade was risky but rewarding. Merchants faced dangers including bandits, storms, shipwrecks, and political instability. Contracts, partnerships, and letters of credit were developed to reduce risk and ensure reliability. Successful merchants often accumulated significant wealth, sometimes rivaling the nobility in influence. Currency played a central role in trade. While barter remained common in villages, coins were increasingly used for larger transactions. Mints produced silver and gold coins, often marked with the seal of a king or local lord. Coinage allowed commerce to expand beyond local communities, connecting regions and even distant countries. Urban economies began to flourish as towns grew into centers of production and trade. Craftsmen organized into guilds, regulating standards, prices, and training. These guilds also provided social support, including aid during illness or death, and contributed to the cultural life of the city through festivals and public works. Merchants and traders were also conduits for cultural exchange. Along with goods, they transported ideas, technologies, fashions, and religious practices. Spices influenced cuisine, fabrics inspired clothing styles, and manuscripts and books spread literacy and learning. In this way, trade connected distant societies, making medieval Europe part of a broader network of human activity. Credit and finance began to emerge alongside trade. Moneylenders, often associated with specific communities, facilitated larger transactions and loans. Banking practices slowly developed, allowing merchants to invest in ventures and manage risk over long distances. These financial innovations laid the groundwork for the complex economic systems of later centuries. Yet, while wealth flowed through cities and towns, it did not always reach the countryside equally. Peasants often relied on local markets and personal barter. Yet even in villages, trade shaped daily life. Local fairs allowed peasants to sell goods, purchase needed items, and participate in cultural exchange, connecting them to a larger economic world. Religious institutions also participated in commerce. Monasteries managed lands, collected tithes, and sometimes engaged in trade of surplus goods. Some abbeys owned mills, breweries, or workshops that produced income.
The church also influenced economic life by regulating interest rates, contracts, and moral obligations in business. The hidden economy of the medieval world thus encompassed far more than mere survival. Markets, fairs, trade routes, guilds, and merchant networks created opportunities, facilitated cultural exchange, and slowly transformed society. They connected the work of peasants, the creativity of artisans, and the ambitions of merchants into a web that linked local communities to the wider world. Through trade and commerce, the medieval world began to move beyond isolated villages and feudal estates. Ideas, goods, and people flowed in patterns that would eventually shape cities, governments, and the emerging European economy. Yet while wealth circulated along these networks, dangers lurked. Piracy on rivers and seas, fraud, political conflicts, and unpredictable natural events could threaten trade at any moment. The medieval economy thrived on both innovation and risk.
Science, invention, and the rediscovery of knowledge. Beneath the castles, markets, and monasteries of the medieval world, another kind of activity quietly shaped the future, the pursuit of knowledge. While faith guided daily life, curiosity about the natural world, medicine, engineering, and mathematics was slowly awakening among scholars, artisans, and monks. Much of medieval learning came from the careful study of ancient texts. During the early centuries of the Middle Ages, much knowledge from Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world had been preserved in monasteries and libraries. Monks copied texts on philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, ensuring their survival even when the outside world faced turmoil. By the 12th and 13th centuries, these texts began to spread widely. Translations from Arabic into Latin introduced European scholars to the works of Aristotle, Avicenna, and other thinkers. These writings inspired debate, inquiry, and experimentation, gradually reshaping European understanding of nature and human life. Universities became centers for this intellectual awakening. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy, trying to reconcile ancient knowledge with religious teachings. While much scientific work was theoretical, careful observation and recording of natural phenomena slowly laid the foundation for later discoveries. Medicine in the medieval world combined ancient theory, religious belief, and practical observation. Physicians often studied the works of Galen and Hippocrates, learning about the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to govern health. Treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, and careful diet. Though primitive by modern standards, these practices reflected an effort to understand and manage illness systematically. Monasteries continued to play a crucial role in scientific preservation. In addition to copying manuscripts, monks studied medicinal plants, recorded weather patterns, and maintained detailed calendars of agricultural and astronomical events. Their observations helped farmers, doctors, and scholars make informed decisions about planting crops, predicting seasons, and treating illness. Technology and invention also advanced during this period, often in hidden or gradual ways. Water mills and windmills improved grain processing, reducing labor for farmers. Improved plows and harnesses increased agricultural efficiency. Mechanical clocks began to appear in towns and monasteries, helping regulate time in daily life. Architectural innovation transformed both religious and secular spaces. Gothic cathedrals with their pointed arches, flying buttresses, and towering spires demonstrated engineering skill and understanding of materials and structure. These constructions required careful measurement, planning, and experimentation, combining artistry with practical science. Alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, fascinated many scholars. Alchemists experimented with metals, minerals, and liquids in the hope of discovering transformation, longevity, or even gold. While often shrouded in mysticism, these experiments contributed to the development of laboratory techniques and chemical understanding over time. Astronomy also gained attention. Observations of stars, planets, and lunar cycles guided calendars, religious festivals, and navigation. Astrolabes and other instruments were developed to measure celestial positions accurately, allowing travelers, merchants, and scholars to track time and direction more precisely. Engineering projects reflected practical problem-solving. Bridges, fortifications, and waterworks required innovation and coordination. Dams and aqueducts managed water supply for towns and agriculture. Siege engines, while designed for warfare, showcased knowledge of mechanics and materials. Even everyday tools and crafts reflected hidden science. Blacksmiths experimented with metals, potters improved kilns, and weavers refined techniques to produce stronger, more durable textiles. Artisans combined observation, experience, and experimentation in ways that often went undocumented but shaped practical knowledge across generations. Despite these advances, knowledge remained limited by social and religious frameworks. Certain ideas were considered controversial or heretical. Scholars often had to reconcile curiosity with faith, balancing the pursuit of understanding with obedience to church authority. Yet even within these constraints, the medieval world preserved and expanded knowledge in ways that would influence the Renaissance and beyond. Science and invention in this period were often collaborative and cumulative. Knowledge traveled through monasteries, universities, and trade routes. Ideas, tools, and techniques borrowed from distant lands slowly integrated into European practice. This hidden network of discovery laid the groundwork for profound transformations in later centuries. The medieval world, while often portrayed as dark or stagnant, was filled with curiosity, experimentation, and gradual progress. Hidden within monasteries, workshops, and classrooms, people questioned, observed, and experimented, creating a bridge between ancient knowledge and the innovations of the future. If you want to continue the story, say,
Legacy and transformation, the hidden layers of life. Knowledge, trade, culture, and daily survival were quietly shaping the foundation of the modern world. While castles, churches, and kings captured the eye of history, it was the work of ordinary people, scholars, merchants, and women that created enduring change. Education and learning, cultivated in monasteries and universities, began to influence thought beyond religious study. The rediscovery of ancient texts, combined with careful observation of nature, inspired new ways of thinking. Scholars debated, wrote, and taught ideas that would ripple into the Renaissance. The medieval pursuit of knowledge, whether in medicine, astronomy, or philosophy, laid the groundwork for scientific inquiry and rational exploration. Trade and commerce had transformed the economy. Local markets, fairs, and long-distance trade connected distant regions, spreading not only goods, but also ideas, culture, and technology. Merchant networks and urban economies helped establish cities as centers of opportunity and innovation. The growth of finance, currency systems, and credit introduced new ways to manage wealth that would influence capitalism in the centuries ahead. Art, literature, and performance reflected both elite and popular culture. Minstrels, storytellers, and artisans preserved legends, folk tales, and knowledge that informed the identity and values of communities. Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and courtly literature demonstrated the medieval blending of devotion, skill, and creativity. Even hidden practices, embroidery, local rituals, and festivals kept cultural memory alive, creating continuity between generations. Women, often overlooked in historical accounts, had shaped life in profound ways.
From managing households and estates to creating art, textiles, and networks of knowledge, women preserved culture and influenced society despite social constraints. Their labor, creativity, and resilience were essential to the functioning and continuity of communities. Social structures, while rigid, were not entirely fixed. The Black Death, labor shortages, and economic shifts began to alter feudal relationships. Peasants gained bargaining power, towns grew in importance, and social mobility, though limited, became possible in ways previously unimaginable. These shifts gradually prepared Europe for larger political, economic, and cultural transformations. The hidden lives of ordinary people, the farmers, craftsmen, traders, scholars, and women, revealed a medieval world far richer and more complex than a simple story of kings and knights. Communities adapted to hardship, preserved knowledge, created beauty, and maintained networks that bound society together. Their contributions, often invisible at the time, shaped the rhythms of life and the trajectory of history. Even as the Renaissance and modern era approached, the medieval world left a lasting imprint. Towns and cities flourished where trade once flowed. Universities continued to educate, building on centuries of accumulated learning. Religious and cultural traditions evolved, while innovations in agriculture, technology, and governance provided the framework for progress. The medieval world was neither entirely dark nor static. Hidden beneath the surface of wars, plagues, and rigid hierarchies was a dynamic, resilient, and creative society. It was a world of ingenuity, adaptation, and human spirit. A world where survival, curiosity, and culture intertwined to produce lasting influence. By examining these hidden layers, education, commerce, art, labor, and social networks, we gain a more complete understanding of the medieval era. Far from being an age of stagnation, it was a complex and transformative period that quietly shaped the path to the modern world we know today. The hidden life of the medieval world reminds us that history is not only made by rulers and battles, but by the ordinary people whose work, knowledge, and creativity sustain civilization across centuries.